Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I found in my travels. Today it is Short Story Tuesday, so I wanted to re-examine a short story from a classic author, and not re-examining the story, but more re-examining the author. And so today I want to talk about a short story about a man who sleeps for far too long. I think you know what I'm getting at. I am referring to Rip Van Winkle by Washington Irving. For those who don't know, and I think those who don't know might be hard to find, but there are people who exist in the world who do not know about Washington Irving. So for those who don't know, and I've talked about Washington Irving before, so if you want to look in more detail, maybe check out my Legend of Sleepy Hollow video that I made. But for those who don't know, again, Washington Irving was an author who lived in the 1800s, who frequently wrote about American culture and wrote about American mythology, frequently writing under pseudonyms such as Diedrich Knickerbocker, and presenting them as perhaps fact rather than the fiction that they were. So in addition to writing fiction, he also wrote history compendiums, which weren't entirely truthful, and he's the source of a lot of the facts of American mythology. So, like, he was like, oh, the Europeans believed the Earth was flat before Columbus, and that's not true at all. But he said it enough so that people just believed it, and so that's where we're at with Washington Irving, telling a lot of mistruths that were later taught in history class for some reason. But anyways, without further ado, let's talk more about this story published in 1819. I will do a little summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So Rip Van Winkle takes place in colonial times initially, when the United States was still under rule by the British. It focuses on the character of Rip Van Winkle, who is a very friendly man, but is quite lazy and loves lazing about instead of doing his chores or doing his work, which seems to upset his wife a little bit. Well, not a little bit, it actually makes her angry, and she chastises him every single chance that she gets, and she's not wrong, because her children are described as wild and not really having someone sturdy to guide them. And that's in large part Rip Van Winkle's fault, because he refuses to do anything, and he's obsessed with other people's business more than he cares about his own. So one day, Rip Van Winkle is hanging out with his friends, some elderly folk, and his wife comes along and says that he should be doing other things. So he decides to head into the forest with his gun, perhaps to do a little hunting, and he also has his dog at the time. When he's in the woods, he discovers some strange and unusual people wearing outfits that don't quite match the time they're in, and they're all drinking from a flagon and playing weird games. And so Rip, in a moment of stupidity, drinks out of the flagon, which I urge you not to do if you're listening to me, because do not drink out of mysterious flagons, because it might be poison or something entirely else, and it will not help you. So anyways, after drinking out of the flagon, he falls asleep. And when he wakes up, he presumes it's the next morning, which kind of upsets him, because he realizes his wife is not going to be happy that he stayed in the woods for an entire evening. But he begins to feel like something has changed, because his gun is very rusty now, and he thinks the mysterious strangers played a joke on him, and the landscape has changed subtly too, and so he's a bit confused by that. When he enters his village, he discovers that everything is kind of changed. He doesn't recognize people's names anymore. And they begin to ask him about voting, to which he replies that he's a loyal subject of the British and there is no voting, which gets him in a little bit of trouble. But someone shows up and they figure out through all this confusion that 20 years have passed for Rip Van Winkle, and he's slept that entire time. His family, like, they've grown up and his wife has died, and they figure out that it must have been Hendrik Hudson doing his magic, and that's really Henry Hudson that they're referring to, with the myth being that he's hanging out in the Catskill Mountains waiting for unwary travelers to do magic things on and trick them and mess up their lives a little bit. The village welcomes Rip Van Winkle back, and he continues to stay in his daughter's hotel and just lays about telling the story through the years. And the village people really start to believe him after he gets some details ironed out, which suggests to me that it might not entirely be true. And then the story ends on a postscript with Dietrich Knickerbocker, Washington Irving's alter ego pen name, telling the audience that he personally knew Rip Van Winkle and was able to judge his character, so he believes that this story is true without a reasonable doubt. In terms of analysis, there is a bit to talk about with this story. The first thing I want to note is the beautiful scenery that Washington Irving uses to describe the Catskill Mountains in this region in the American Northeast. It's very clear from the start that Washington Irving loves this area, and he loves this place, and there's a real passion for these places that maybe he doesn't completely understand, but is nestled in his heart because I guess he's lived there for so long. He's able to just talk about the majesty of the sun setting, or what the forest looks like. So there's a good quote that I would like to read to you. Every change of season, every change of weather, indeed every hour of the day produces some change in the magical hues and shapes of these mountains, and they are regarded by all the good wives far and near as perfect barometers. And so right there at the very beginning, he's describing it as magical and filled with just a variety of colors that change depending on the season. It's just very beautiful. But I like how he uses the term magic, as if there's something within these mountains that we can't quite put our finger on, and is capable of doing unusual things to the people who pass by, which might have been people's thoughts at the time, because we haven't completely settled this land yet, so who knows what could be out there. And I feel like that's very similar to how Washington Irving described Sleepy Hollow and that region of New York, where there was still a lot of mystery in the air, and not a lot of people knew much about this landscape, but at the same time it was very beautifully described, and it was clear that Washington Irving had spent a lot of time here really learning about this place and falling in love with it. And so I really feel that adds to the story here. Another thing worth talking about is the sexism within it. Dame Van Winkle is described as a very angry and henpecking type of lady who makes Rip Van Winkle's life a bit of a mess. And I feel like that's a little sexism on Washington Irving's part, because of the way he describes this woman. And although it's very clear that Rip Van Winkle does have some blame for making her this way, it still seems like Washington Irving is trying to argue oh, women be tripping, yo, or something like that. He's trying to paint Dame Van Winkle as angry for unnecessary reasons. But it's very clear that she has a right to be angry. Her children are wild. Her husband's not really providing for the family. She's probably in a loveless marriage or something like that. But it really seems like Washington Irving is trying to say, like, women can't live with them, And you find the same thing in Sleepy Hollow too, with Ichabod painted as sort of a down on his luck kind of character who just can't seem to get the ladies to fall for him, especially the woman he's seeking out in the story. Makes me wonder if Washington Irving has had some trouble with the women in his life. Because this seems very misogynistic in a lot of ways. And you could just chalk it up to, this is of the time. But, if we don't call out sexism when we see it, that's a problem. So just a minor problem that comes off as very obvious in this story. And the last thing I want to talk about is myth making. As I mentioned this in my Sleepy Hollow video, as well as, in the beginning of this video, where Washington Irving was known for his myth making, maybe building up the legends about American society that would be passed through the generations. He was one of the first authors to really do that, to say what is America, and who were the people who built America, building larger than life characters. So in this story, he's mixing the myths of the old world with that of the new, where in Sleepy Hollow, he was talking about headless ghosts of the old world and infusing them with what's going on in the new world, such as that of the American Revolution, talking about all sorts of things. He does that here as well. He mixes the Indian myths, talking about the Manitou and the nefarious forest spirits who prey on weary travelers and make their lives a little bit more miserable. You also get the myths of the old country mixed in with that. For example, fairies, and he's talking about Henry Hudson. And so what you end up with in this story is the old myths of the Indians mixed with the older myths of the fairies, or the mischievous creatures that hide out in the woods and give you flagons of ale that put you to sleep and cause you to sleep for 20 years. I think it's fascinating how he's able to blend all of this together to create a very new type of myth in Rip Van Winkle. There's another good quote that I would like to read to you. Even to this day, they never hear a thunderstorm of a summer afternoon about the Catskill, but they say Hendrik Hudson and his crew are at the game of ninepins, and it is common wish of all hen-backed husbands in the neighborhood, when life hangs heavy on their hands, that they might have a quick quieting draught of Rip Van Winkle's flagon, which I think is a little bit funny, but also getting at that sexism. But yeah, so with that quote, you're sort of building up, the legend of Rip Van Winkle, but also what you might find in the unknowable Catskill Mountains at the time. And what's also interesting is in the very next page, the author's note, told from the perspective of Diedrich Knickerbocker. Diedrich is saying that he believes this, that he's met Rip Van Winkle, a person doesn't actually exist, mind you, and he believes Rip Van Winkle's story without a bit of doubt. So again, building up the legend of Rip Van Winkle, asserting, oh, I've heard this, I've seen this before, so of course it has to be true. And ultimately, when you reflect on it, like, Washington Irving was very successful in what he tried to do, because not only are the legend of Sleepy Hollow embedded in American culture, but a lot of children grow up learning about Rip Van Winkle. It's a completely fictional story, but it's embedded in American society enough that it's just something we pass down from generation to generation. Maybe not other aspects that Washington Irving was trying to say, but here, and also with some of the myths that are taught in school, it really seems like Washington Irving was successful in building these myths and making them worthy of telling to future generations. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Rip Van Winkle by Washington Irving, or Diedrich Knickerbocker, as he claims to be. It's a very good short story. I didn't like it as much as The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, but I did think it was enjoyable, so I definitely recommend it to you out there if you're looking for a bit of American culture or American legends, that's a good short story to seek out. Otherwise, perhaps seek out one of Washington Irving's other short stories. They're just as good, I promise you. If you read this story before, you simply want to comment on what I just said here, feel free to comment below in the comments. I would love to hear from you. Let's have a discussion about these legends and Rip Van Winkle. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that other people can find out about Rip Van Winkle if they don't already know. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and sleepy travels. Farewell.